He broke my arm. That's what she whispered into a stranger's phone at 11 o'clock at night, standing in a hospital hallway in Buffalo with her back to the wall, watching the corner he'd come around any second. Adeline Kerrigan was 27 years old, and she taught grown men and women how to read. Not children, adults. 50-year-old roofers who'd hidden it their whole lives. Grandmothers who signed their names with an X. She worked nights at a community learning center on the east side of the city, and she hadn't been paid for a single one of those nights in over a year. She never complained about it. She just kept showing up. That Friday in February, she'd walked through the doors of Mercy General, holding her left arm against her chest at an angle a human arm isn't built to hold. The man beside her had a hand on her shoulder and a smile that arrived before anyone asked him a single question. He told the nurse she'd slipped on an icy step, and the nurse smiled back at him. She smiled back at him before she'd even looked at Adeline. That's the whole thing right there, isn't it? Adeline had known for months that nobody in this city was ever going to believe her over him. She'd tried once. The report went into his office, and it never came out the other side, so she didn't scream. She waited until he walked off down the hall. She borrowed that phone, and she dialed the only number she'd ever memorized, a number that hadn't belonged to anyone in 8 years. She expected silence. She expected a recording telling her the line was no longer in service. It rang twice. Somebody picked up, and 380 miles south of her, in a room where nobody ever raised their voice because nobody ever had to, a man she'd never met in her life stood up in the middle of a conversation and said, "I'm coming. If this one's already got you, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss how it ends. Share it with somebody who needs to hear it tonight. Your support is what keeps these stories alive." Now let's go back to that hallway in Buffalo and find out exactly who answered a number that hadn't belonged to anyone in 8 years. The telephone rang 3 long times before anyone had a chance to understand what was happening. In Brooklyn, at 5 minutes past 11 that night, inside the back room of a warehouse on Vandervoort Street, 7 men were seated around a long table, and not one of them heard the ringing before Rocco Vasari did. He was 37 years old. He had occupied the head of that table for 6 years, and in all those years, no one had ever seen him interrupt another man. The man speaking was a concrete contractor from Queens, explaining why a contract had fallen 11 weeks behind schedule, and he was halfway through a sentence when he stopped, because Rocco had turned his head toward the cabinet against the wall. The ringing wasn't coming from any telephone belonging to anyone in the room. It was coming from the second drawer. No one remembered what was inside that drawer. Tommaso Calderone did. He was 54 years old, had stood beside 3 generations of men who had ruled this family, and he was the only person in the room who knew that the drawer had a small lock whose key Rocco kept. He watched Rocco rise. He saw that Rocco didn't hurry. That was what sent a chill down his spine, because Rocco Vasari never hurried, but he also never stood up while another man was speaking. Rocco opened the drawer. Inside lay an old flip phone, the kind that had gone out of production long ago, with a screen no larger than 2 joints of a finger, glowing in the darkness of the cabinet. He looked at it for another second, only 1 second. Then he picked it up and opened it. The entire room fell silent in the way rooms like that always fell silent, without anyone giving an order, without anyone clearing his throat, without anyone shifting a chair. The man from Queens still had his mouth open in the middle of a word. Rocco pressed the phone to his ear and spoke 3 words. Then he listened. "Mr." Calderone watched him the entire time. And years later, whenever he told the story, he always said that what he remembered most wasn't what Rocco said, but what he didn't do. He didn't ask the caller to repeat anything. He didn't furrow his brow. He didn't lift a hand to rub the back of his neck the way men often did when bad news reached them. He simply stood there with the telephone against his ear, his eyes fixed on some point across the tabletop, and his entire body passed into a state mister. Calderone had witnessed only twice in his life, both times on nights after which everything was different by morning. Rocco spoke 2 more short sentences. Then he closed the phone. He remained standing exactly where he was, and the silence in the room began to grow so heavy that someone had to swallow hard. The man from Queens was the first one who couldn't bear it. He gave a strained little laugh and said that, if something urgent had come up, he could return the following week. He spoke with the voice of a man who had just realized he was sitting in the wrong place at the wrong time. No one answered him. Rocco placed the old telephone in the middle of the table, where everyone could see it. Then he spoke, and his voice was no louder than when he had greeted them upon entering the room. He said Kerrigan's number had just rung. 3 men in the room didn't understand what those words meant. The other 4 did. And it was the reaction of those 4 that made the remaining 3 understand that they were witnessing something larger than any contract ever discussed in that room. One man pushed his chair back nearly 2 feet without standing. Another placed both hands flat on the table as though he needed something solid to hold onto. Mr. Calderon didn't move at all. He asked only one question, very softly, whether Rocco was certain. Rocco looked at him. He said no one else in the world had that number. Mr. Calderon remained silent for 3 seconds, then asked his second question. Who had called? Rocco answered with a name no one in that room had ever heard spoken, the name of someone who, by every ordinary rule, shouldn't have existed in their world. He said it was his sister. Mr. Calderon blinked exactly once. Rocco turned to the man from Queens and told him the meeting was over, that the 11-week delay would be discussed another day, and that he should go home immediately. The man stood so quickly that he knocked over his chair and didn't bother setting it upright. When the door closed behind him, Rocco picked up the old telephone and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and there was something final in the movement, like a man putting away something that, from that moment forward, would never leave his body again. He told Mr. Calderon that he needed a car with a full tank of gas in 10 minutes. Mr. Calderon asked where they were going. Rocco said Buffalo. Someone in the room let out a breath, because Buffalo was nearly 400 miles from where they stood, because thick snow was falling outside, and because no one there had ever heard Rocco Vasari say he was leaving the city after midnight for any reason. Mr. Calderon didn't ask why. He rose, walked toward the door, and paused for only a single heartbeat to tell Rocco that he wasn't going alone. Rocco didn't answer. He only looked at the fallen chair on the floor, then toward the window where the snow swept sideways through the streetlights in long slanting ribbons of white. And there was only one thought in his mind. After 8 years of absolute silence inside that dark drawer, the waiting was finally over. 8 years earlier, when Rocco was still a 29-year-old man with no authority to decide anything in the family, there was a 26-year-old named Sean Kerrigan who kept their books. He wasn't one of them. He was an accountant who had finished college at night with money earned from working the graveyard shift, and he possessed something very few people in that world had, a memory for numbers so exact it was frightening. Rocco had once told his father that Sean was the only man he trusted. His father had laughed and said that in their line of work, no one could be trusted. There were only people who hadn't yet been given a reason to betray you. Rocco hadn't argued, but he still placed every ledger connected to the work under his responsibility in Sean's hands. And for 3 years, not a single number was wrong. Not $1 disappeared, and not once did Sean ask a question he shouldn't have asked. Then, one evening in September, Sean called him and said there was something in the books that didn't add up, that he had checked it 3 times, and that someone on the inside was selling them out. Rocco told him not to speak to anyone, and to wait for him. He left that very night. He arrived too late. He made it to the hospital only for the final 40 minutes, and during those 40 minutes, Sean Kerrigan was conscious for perhaps half of them. He didn't speak about the person who had done it. He didn't speak about the numbers. He gripped Rocco's wrist and said 2 things, and neither of them had anything to do with himself. The first was, "Keep my sister out of this." The second was, "Keep this number." Rocco asked why. Sean said she had belonged to that number since she was 9 years old, that it was the first number she had ever memorized, and that if she ever called it one day, it would mean she had no one else left to call. Then he added one final sentence. "Don't let her know what I did." Rocco promised him both things. He had never broken a promise in his life, but he had also never made one that demanded a price from him, month after month, the way that promise did. 96 months. That was the number. 96 times he saw the telephone bill of a dead man lying among the papers on his desk. 96 times he approved payment for a line that had never rung even once. And throughout those 8 years, no one ever asked him about it, because no one dared, and because the amount was so small that it disappeared among hundreds of other entries. There were months when he almost forgot it existed, but he never stopped paying. And now Mr. Calderon was standing between him and the door, his arms hanging at his sides, with no intention of stepping aside. Rocco said he was leaving now. Mr. Calderon said he knew. Then he repeated the very rule Rocco himself had established in the spring of his 2nd year in power. The rule that no one in this family left the city alone. No one at all. No exceptions. And the man who had stood in the middle of this room and declared it had been Rocco himself. Rocco said that tonight he wasn't going in any official capacity. Mr. Calderon said that didn't matter, that if outsiders saw him leave alone at midnight after a telephone call witnessed by an entire room, then within 48 hours, 3 other families would know about it, and they wouldn't assume he had gone to save someone. They would assume he was running from something. Rocco said nothing. Mr. Calderon continued, telling him that he could hate it as much as he pleased. But he couldn't break the rule he had written with his own hand, and then stand before everyone tomorrow and demand that they obey it. Rocco looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Fine. 2 cars, no more." Mr. Calderon nodded. Rocco continued, saying that the 2 cars would follow behind him and keep their distance, and whenever he stopped anywhere, they would remain inside their vehicles. No one would enter the hospital. No one would enter any building. No one would speak to anyone. No one would do anything unless he called. Mr. Calderon asked what would happen if he didn't call. Rocco said then they would stay outside until morning. Mr. Calderon asked one more question, the last one, whether this was family business. Rocco answered that it wasn't, that this was his business, and that was exactly why he needed everyone to stand still. Mr. Calderon watched him for another moment, then turned away, and when he reached the door, he told the other 6 men that anyone who couldn't go should leave for home immediately, and anyone who was going should be downstairs in the yard in 10 minutes, dressed warmly, with a full tank of gas, and carrying nothing the New York State Police might want to ask about. No one went home. Outside, the snow was still falling, growing thicker over the road, and Rocco remained alone in the empty room for another 10 seconds, one hand resting against the pocket of his coat where the old telephone lay, feeling its tiny weight through the fabric, a weight he had paid to preserve for 8 years, without ever truly knowing why he had continued to keep it. 40 minutes after leaving the city, the wind off the lake began sweeping sideways across the highway, driving the snow into long white bands that slashed through the beams of the headlights and made it feel as though they were driving into the heart of something rather than passing through it. Rocco kept one hand on the wheel and dialed with the other. The first person he called was Frank Delahunt, 66 years old, retired for 4 years after spending 30 years with the Bureau, now living in a small house outside Rochester, and answering the telephone close to midnight, in the voice of a man who hadn't been asleep at all. He listened without interrupting once. Then he asked whether she had been admitted to the hospital. Rocco said she had. Delahunt told him there was one thing he needed to understand before he did anything else, that New York State required medical facilities to create a record whenever a doctor suspected injuries caused by abuse, even if the patient denied it, even if the patient lied with perfect ease, and that record couldn't be made to disappear simply because someone wanted it gone. It remained in the system. It carried a date and a time. It carried the name of the person who entered it. 6 months later, 2 years later, it would still be there, and it would carry exactly the same weight it carried tonight. Rocco asked, "What about the other man?" Frank Delahunt fell silent for a moment, then said this was more complicated than Rocco thought, because someone who worked in a prosecutor's office wasn't overseen by the local police, and certainly wasn't overseen by the very office where he sat. He said that if a complaint passed through that door, it would die there, every single time. But above that office, he continued, there were still other agencies, some at the state level, some at the federal level, and those places worked from records, not relationships. Then he said one final thing, that the only thing capable of reaching a man like that was paperwork, not anything else. And he hoped Rocco understood what he meant. Rocco said, "I understand." He ended the call and drove another 15 miles before calling the second person. Kit Donnelly was 49 years old and had run her own civil law practice in Buffalo for 11 years. She answered after 4 rings, her voice rough with sleep. She heard 3 sentences and sat upright. She asked whether the woman was still with him. Rocco said no, that he was somewhere in the hospital. Kit told him to listen carefully and repeat every word exactly as she said it. She said that from this moment forward, everything the woman said to him could become something used against her, and everything he said to her could become something used against him, but only if someone recorded it. She told Rocco to have her write everything down before she spoke another word to him. The date, the time, the place, the exact words. She said not to write down feelings, not to write down guesses, only what had happened, because people could dismiss emotion, but they couldn't dismiss a timeline. Rocco asked, what if she had already been writing it down? Kit Donnelly was silent for 2 seconds, then said that if she had, she was smarter than 80% of the people who had ever sat in her office. The third person was Owen Brandt, 44 years old, a private investigator in Buffalo, and he was the only one of the three who didn't ask a single question about the circumstances. He asked only for a name. Rocco said Preston Hale. Brant repeated it once to make sure, then said all right. Rocco said, I need everything. Not the part people can see, but everything underneath it. Former addresses, relationships that ended, every complaint ever filed and later withdrawn, every dollar that came in and went out, every name that had ever appeared beside his and then disappeared. Owen Brant asked how long he had. Rocco said before Monday morning. Brant let out a breath and said that gave him 54 hours, and work like that would be expensive. Rocco said, I know. Owen Brant said, I'll start tonight. Rocco ended the call and rested the telephone on his thigh. And for the next 15 minutes, he didn't call anyone else. The two cars behind him held their distance in the rearview mirror, two pairs of dim yellow lights moving through the curtain of snow, patient exactly as they had been instructed to be. He thought about the 3 calls he had just made, and realized that in none of them had he used the thing an entire city believed was the only instrument he knew how to use. He hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't asked anyone for a favor. He had asked about the law, and as the road slipped beneath him in alternating ribbons of white and black, he thought of something else, something far more bitter, that for 8 years he had known she existed, known her name, known she lived less than 400 miles away, and not once had he gone to find her. He had called that keeping his promise. He had called it respect. But now, in the middle of the night, on an empty highway leading toward a hospital he had never entered, he admitted to himself that there was another name, a far more accurate one for what he had done throughout those 8 years, and that name was convenience. The physician on night duty at Mercy General was named Helen Vogt, and she stood before the screen studying Adeline Kerrigan's x-rays far longer than she needed to reach a conclusion. The conclusion had been clear within the first 10 seconds. Both bones in her forearm were broken, and both fracture lines spiraled around the shafts of the bones instead of cutting straight across them. Doctor, Vogt had seen that kind of fracture many times during her 30 years in medicine, and it didn't come from a fall. When people fell, they threw out their hands to catch themselves, and when they did, the bones broke across, shattered, or fractured near the wrist. This was different. This was the kind of injury that happened only when a twisting force was applied to the forearm, while the rest of the arm was held in place. She returned to the examination room and asked the nurse to bring her a medium-sized splint kit, speaking in such an ordinary voice that no one noticed she had deliberately sent another person out of the room. When only the 2 of them remained, she pulled a chair beside the bed, sat down at Addie's eye level, and asked exactly one question. She asked whether someone had done this to her. There was no careful introduction beforehand. There was no lecture afterward. Just one question, followed by silence while she waited. Addie looked at her. She was 27 years old, and she had been thinking about the answer to that question for 14 months, building and tearing down at least 50 different versions of it in her mind. Yet when the real question was finally placed before her, she heard herself give the easiest answer. She said, I slipped. She said the front steps of the house had frozen over and she had slipped. Dr. Vogt nodded once. She didn't ask again. She didn't say she didn't believe her. She stood, walked to the desk in the corner of the room, and began to write. Addie watched her back and saw that she wrote for a long time, far longer than anyone would need to record a single line about someone slipping on ice, and something inside her shifted very slightly. What Dr. Vogt was entering into the medical record was the phrase she was required to document under state regulations. The phrase stating that the injuries were inconsistent with the reported mechanism. She wrote it 3 times in 3 different sections. She recorded the time. She recorded her name. Then she returned, and while she placed a cast on Addie's left arm from the elbow down to just above the fingers, she talked about things that were completely harmless, about how the plaster would grow warm as it dried, about the need to keep it dry, about how the sling across her shoulder would be uncomfortable for the first 3 days, and then gradually become easier to tolerate. When she was finished, she handed Addie a sheet of care instructions, and on the back of it she had written a telephone number by hand. She said, "This is my direct number. It doesn't go through the switchboard. It doesn't go through anyone else." She said, "I work 3 nights a week, and I always answer." Then she said one last thing, that Addie didn't have to tell her anything now, and after saying it, she walked out without looking back. Addie held the paper in her right hand. She folded it into quarters and slipped it beneath the fabric of the sling, into a place no one would think to search. And as she did, she remembered the previous August, the only time she had found enough courage to walk into a police station and sit for 40 minutes while a young officer carefully wrote down everything she told him, a report that, according to procedure, should have been forwarded to the Erie County District Attorney's Office for review. It had been sent there, and after that, it had never emerged from the other side. She hadn't told anyone about it. She had never told anyone. Then the door opened, and Preston Hale entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one on the table beside the bed even though she couldn't drink it, then pulled his chair close and sat down, and he stared at her cast for a long time with the expression of a man who had just seen something that broke his heart. He said he had spoken to the nurse at the desk. He said he had told her that he was partly to blame, that he should have spread salt over the front steps that afternoon, that Addie had reminded him twice and he had kept putting it off. He said all of it in a low, even voice, with just the right trace of emotion catching in his throat at just the right moment. Then he said he had overheard the doctor mention something about the x-rays, and he asked whether she had said anything to Addie. He asked it very gently, almost as though the question meant nothing. Addie said, "Nothing at all." He nodded and gave her right hand a soft squeeze, then began talking about how they would manage things at home the next day, about how he would take half the day off, about how she needed to stay away from teaching for at least 2 weeks. Addie didn't answer. She rested her head against the pillow and looked up at the ceiling, where square acoustic tiles were arranged in perfectly even rows, and she began to count them. She counted from left to right, from the edge of the wall to the light fixture. 11 tiles. Then the second row. 11 more. She had done that since she was a child. Whenever something happened that she couldn't stop, she counted something she could count, and Preston's voice continued flowing beside her, warm and composed, while she moved on to the third row. At 5 minutes past 6 in the morning, there were 2 knocks at the door, and the man who entered room 214 was someone Addie had never seen before in her life. He was tall and broad, with closely cropped salt and pepper hair, and melted snow still clung to the shoulders of his coat. He stopped about 6.5 feet from the foot of the bed and didn't take another step. Preston had left at 4 o'clock to go home and change his clothes. There were only 2 people in the room. Addie managed to push herself halfway upright with her right hand, and she heard her own voice ask who he was. He said, "Rocco Vasari." The name meant nothing to her. Then he added that he had known her brother. For one moment, the entire room seemed to recede, and the sound of the heart monitor in the corner became unbearably loud. Addie didn't speak for about 5 seconds. Then she asked why he had answered her brother's telephone. He said, "Because he told me to answer it." She stared at him, and felt something inside her chest begin beating out of rhythm, not because she was afraid, but because something she had believed for 8 years had just been seized and shaken hard. She said her brother had been an accountant. She said he had worked for an equipment distribution company in Queens, and had died in what the police called a hit-and-run traffic accident in September of 2017, and she recited the words as though they had been carved into stone long ago. Rocco didn't answer. It was his silence that frightened her. She asked what he did for a living. He remained quiet just long enough to make the answer unnecessary, and Addie understood, not through reason, but through something deeper, that the man standing in her hospital room at 6 o'clock in the morning, the man who had driven all night through a snowstorm to reach her, hadn't been her brother's old friend in any sense she could accept. She told him to get out. Rocco didn't move. She said it louder, telling him that she didn't know who he was, that she hadn't asked anyone to come, that she had called the wrong number and was sorry for disturbing him, and she heard her voice break on the final word and hated herself for it. She said, "Get out." Rocco looked at her for one more moment. Then he gave the slightest nod and said, "All right." He didn't argue. He didn't offer another word of explanation. He turned, walked out, and closed the door so gently that Addie didn't hear the latch catch. She sat there breathing hard, her right hand gripping the edge of the blanket, and nearly a minute passed before she realized she was trembling. Out in the hallway, Rocco took 4 steps and stopped beside the row of plastic chairs against the wall across from her room. He removed his coat, folded it across his lap, and sat down. He didn't call anyone. He didn't look at his telephone. He sat with his back straight, staring at the closed door about 10 feet away, and remained that way for 1 hour and 25 minutes, while the night shift handed over to the morning staff, while the breakfast cart rolled past, while the darkness outside faded into the pale gray of a February morning in Buffalo. At exactly 7:30, The elevator doors opened, and Preston Hale stepped out. He had showered, changed into another suit, and carried a bouquet of white daisies wrapped in paper. He walked down the corridor with the stride of a man who knew exactly where he was and knew he was welcome there. He passed the row of plastic chairs. Then he slowed. Then he stopped completely. He turned his head and looked at the man sitting there. And Addie, who had just managed to push her door open a crack after hearing familiar footsteps, saw everything through the narrow opening. She saw Preston's face change. It didn't turn pale. It didn't harden. It did something far more subtle. It rearranged itself, like the face of a man who had opened the wrong door and, within half a second, had already decided what role he would play on the other side. Then he smiled. He said, "Mr. Vasari." He spoke the name slowly and distinctly, like a man placing a card on the table that he had been holding for a very long time. Then he said Brooklyn was a long way from here. Rocco looked up at him. He didn't stand. He didn't answer. Preston kept smiling, shifted the bouquet from one hand to the other, and added that the weather the night before couldn't have made such a long drive very pleasant. Still, there was no answer. The two men looked at each other across the space of 3 footsteps in a hospital corridor washed in fluorescent light, and neither of them moved, and the silence between them wasn't the silence of 2 strangers. Addie pushed the door open wider. Both men turned toward her at the same time. She stood there with her left arm in a cast suspended in a sling, her hair disheveled, her face ghostly pale beneath the lights, and she looked from one man to the other, then back again. Then she asked, "Do you two know each other?" No one answered that question in the hallway. Preston entered the room, placed the flowers on the table, kissed her forehead, and said he had to be at the office by 9 o'clock, that he would come back for her at 11, and that she should get some more rest. He didn't mention the man outside. He walked past the row of plastic chairs without looking over. 10 minutes later, Addie opened the door herself and told Rocco that she wanted to hear the truth. He entered the room and remained standing in exactly the same place as before. He kept it brief. He said the man who had just left was the first assistant district attorney of Erie County, that for the past 2 years he had been building a case under New York State's enterprise corruption law, a kind of law that allowed prosecutors to charge an entire organization rather than only individual people, and that the organization he was targeting was the Construction and Waste Collection Division her family owned in western New York. He said the name written on the cover of that case file was his. Addie stood leaning against the side of the bed and said nothing for a long time. Then she asked how long Preston had known she was Sean's sister. Rocco said, "I assume from the very beginning." Addie shook her head. She said no. She said they had met at a fundraiser for the public library, that she had been the one who started the conversation, that she had walked over to him and introduced herself because she needed someone in the prosecutor's office to sign a verification form for one of her students. She said, "I was the one who approached him." Rocco didn't argue. He only said he had no proof of what he had just told her, that it was only what he believed, and that he could be wrong. But the way he said it made Addie understand that he didn't believe he was wrong at all, and anger tightened her right hand into a fist. She said he knew nothing about Preston. She said he had only been there for 2 hours. Rocco said that was true. He said she could tell him to leave at any time, and he would leave. Then he added one more thing, that if she intended to go home with Preston that day, he needed to know beforehand, not so he could stop her, but so he would know where he needed to be. Addie was silent for quite a while. Then she said, "I'm going back." She said, "I'm going back for 2 days." Rocco said no. She said, "You just told me you wouldn't stop me." He said, "I just lied." It was the first thing said that morning that almost made her laugh, and she didn't laugh. She explained. She said there was a cardboard box in Preston's attic, that inside it were all the belongings her brother had left behind. A box she had carried from place to place 4 times in 8 years, and had never opened. A box she had brought with her when she moved into Preston's house 10 months earlier. She said, "If I don't go back now, if I disappear this morning, the first thing he'll do is go up to the attic." She said, "I know him. He won't smash anything. He'll clean up." Rocco asked why she needed the box. Addie said, "I don't know." She said, "I only know that if you're right, even partly right, then that box is the only thing in that house that belongs to me, and that he has never touched." Rocco looked at her for a moment, then asked how long 2 days meant. She said from today until Monday morning. She said he wouldn't touch her during those 2 days, that he never did so immediately afterward, that he would cook and be gentle and apologize in 6 different ways. none of which would be a real apology, and she said the entire thing in the flat, steady voice of someone reading a weather report, and that was what made Rocco turn his face away for half a second. He said, "All right." He said, "2 days." Addie said, "I'm not finished." She stepped away from the bed, walked 2 paces toward him, lifted her head, and looked straight into his face. Then she said she had one condition. Rocco waited. Addie said, "No bodies." She said, "Not his, not anyone else's. No one in this entire matter." She said, "I don't care who you are, and I don't care what you promised my brother." She said, "If you break that promise, I'll go into court myself and testify against you. And I'll tell them everything I know, including anything I learn from tonight onward." She said, "I mean it." Then she stood there and waited. Rocco didn't answer immediately. He didn't answer for 3 seconds. He didn't answer for 10. She saw his jaw move once, saw his hand open and then close again, and she realized she was asking this man to surrender the one thing his entire life had been built upon, and that he was truly considering it, rather than searching for a lie that would quiet her. The silence lasted long enough to make breathing difficult. Then Rocco said, "I promise." He said the 2 words very softly. Then he added that she should understand what she had just taken from him. Addie said, "I do." She said, "That's why I made you say it out loud." Preston picked her up at 11 o'clock, just as he had said he would, and throughout the 40-minute drive home, he didn't ask a single question about the man who had been sitting in the hallway. That was the first thing Addie noted. The second thing she noted was that he had turned on the heating system before leaving, so the air inside the house was already warm when they opened the door and stepped in. He helped her settle into a chair, placed a pillow beneath the elbow of her casted arm, and did all of it with the careful attention of a man carrying out a procedure he had committed to memory. By noon, he was cooking. He cooked throughout the next 2 days, 3 meals a day, and brought every plate directly to her. He cut everything into small pieces, because she could use only one hand. He remembered exactly when she was supposed to take her pain medication, and brought her water before the thought even occurred to her. He called the learning center and told Ruth Ann Pell that Addie would be away for 2 weeks, and he said it in the voice of a man protecting someone from her own stubbornness. He apologized 6 times over those 2 days, and Addie counted every one of them. The first time, he said he was deeply sorry that things had gone so far. The second time, he said he knew he hadn't been the best version of himself lately. The third time, he said his work was slowly killing him and that he shouldn't have brought it home. The fourth time, he said they had both said things they shouldn't have said. The fifth time, he said he was sorry she had felt that way. The sixth time, he simply held her hand and said he loved her more than she realized. Not once, in any of those 6 apologies, did a subject stand before a specific action. Not once did he say, "I broke your arm." Addie lay on the couch and watched him speak, and she realized that she had heard those same 6 sentences over the past 10 months, in exactly that order, and that she had once believed at least 4 of them. She texted Rocco from inside the bathroom, with the door locked and the exhaust fan running. She didn't write anything meaningful. She wrote that the snow had started falling again that afternoon. She wrote that dinner was pumpkin soup, and that it was a little too salty. She wrote that her arm hurt less than it had the day before. Rocco answered with equally ordinary things, that the sky was clear where he was, that he had never eaten pumpkin soup, that it was good to hear. They both understood that every message on the phone could be read, and they both wrote as though that would certainly happen. Only once did she write something different. She wrote that he hadn't gone up to the attic. Rocco replied with one word, "Good." The first night passed without anything happening. So did the second. It was that very absence of anything that exhausted her, because she had to keep the same expression on her face for 48 hours. Had to smile at the right moments. Had to say thank you at the right moments. Had to let him brush her hair on Saturday night because she had only one usable hand and because refusing would have been an answer. On Sunday afternoon, he went out. He said he had a meeting with the campaign committee and would be home before 7 o'clock. Addie listened to his car pull out of the driveway. She waited another 7 minutes. Then she went up to the attic. The hatch in the second-floor hallway ceiling had to be pulled down with a cord, and doing it with one hand took her nearly 2 minutes. Sean's box sat in the farthest corner, exactly where she had placed it 10 months earlier, and from a distance it looked exactly the same. But when she came closer, she saw that the strip of tape sealing the lid had been cut in a straight line down the middle, then covered with another strip of tape, clear tape, not the brown kind she had used. She stood staring at that cut for a long time. Then she opened the lid. Everything inside was still there. She counted every item she remembered, and nothing was missing. But the contents had been rearranged. They were neater now, more orderly, sorted by size, and Addie knew with absolute certainty that she had thrown everything into that box on a September afternoon in 2017, when tears had blurred her vision so badly that she could barely see, and that nothing inside it had ever been neatly arranged. She sat down on the attic floor with the open box before her, and she didn't cry. She reached deep inside, and among the old papers at the bottom, between things she hadn't placed there herself, she found a small piece of paper folded in half. She opened it. It was a receipt for the rental of a self-storage unit on Walden Road, with 3 months paid in advance, and on the tenant's signature line was the name Preston Hale, written in the same handwriting she had seen hundreds of times on cards and checks, and the date beside it was October 19th, 4 months earlier, 6 months after she had moved into this house. On Monday morning, Preston left for work at 7:45. By 8:15, Addie was sitting in a breakfast diner on Elmwood Street, with the sling across her shoulder and a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Owen Brandt arrived 4 minutes before Rocco. He was 44 years old, carrying a document case thinner than Addie had expected, and he didn't shake anyone's hand. He simply sat down and said that he had been given 54 hours, so what he had found was only the surface. He opened the case. He said the first thing was that during Preston Hale's 7 years at the Erie County District Attorney's Office, 2 internal complaints had been filed against him. Both had been filed by women. Both concerned his conduct, rather than his professional performance, and both had been withdrawn, one after 11 days and the other after 9. Addie asked who the women were. Owen Brandt said he didn't have their names yet, only the case numbers and dates, because withdrawn internal complaints were sealed. He said he was still looking. Then he moved to the second matter and turned to the next page. He said Preston Hale's campaign for Erie County District Attorney had received $340,000 over the past 14 months. He said there was nothing unusual about that amount for a county-level campaign. What was unusual was that roughly 1/3 of the money had come from individuals and small businesses whose names also appeared on the donor list of a nonprofit organization called the Lakeshore Futures Foundation, and that the donors' money had gone into the foundation first, before flowing back out as individual campaign contributions. An arrangement, he said, was formally legal, but made it extremely difficult to trace who was truly paying whom. He said the founder and chairman of the board of the Lakeshore Futures Foundation was Preston Hale. Then he stopped. He looked at Addie and said he wasn't sure whether the detail meant anything, but the foundation had an education grant portfolio, and one of its grant recipients was the East Buffalo Community Learning Center. Addie said nothing. She took the paper from his hand and read it, and she read it very slowly, and Rocco, sitting across from her, watched her face remain completely unchanged for 20 full seconds. She didn't turn pale. She didn't flinch. Nothing moved at all. Then she placed the paper on the table. She asked Owen Brandt whether he had the dates of the funding rounds. He said he did. She asked about September of the previous year. He turned through the papers, searched for a moment, then said that in September, the foundation had conducted a portfolio review and cut 4 grants, including one awarded to that center, the grant for its evening program, worth $22,000 a year. He said the reason recorded in the meeting minutes was a restructuring of priorities. Addie gave the smallest nod. Then she spoke, addressing the table rather than anyone sitting around it, and said that in September of the previous year, Ruth Ann Pell had called her into her office and told her the evening class would have to close because the funding was gone. She said the evening class had 23 students, and she had asked Mrs. Pell whether the class could remain open if she taught without pay, and Mrs. Pell had cried and said she couldn't ask her to do that, and Addie had answered that no one was asking her. She said 17 months had passed since that day. She said she had taught 3 evenings a week for 17 months without receiving a single dollar. She said she had sold her mother's car to make up the difference in her rent. She said she had moved in with Preston in April of the previous year because she could no longer afford her home, and she spoke every sentence in the same flat, steady voice, one after another, like someone tracing the points along a length of rope to discover where it had been tied. Then she stopped. Owen Brandt started to say something. She raised her right hand. She sat perfectly still for about 5 seconds. Then she said he was the chairman of the board that had cut the funding. She said, I lost my salary because of him. She said, I lost my home because I lost my salary. She said, I moved into his house because I lost my home. She said, I stayed in his house for 10 months because I had nowhere else to go. Then she said the final thing, and her voice still didn't rise above the level at which she had begun. She said, he didn't push me into that situation. He built it, and then he invited me to step inside. No one at the table spoke. Owen Brandt lowered his eyes to the papers in front of him. Rocco remained still and didn't reach toward her, didn't offer a single word of comfort, didn't do anything at all, because he understood that anything he said in that moment would only become another way of telling her that she hadn't been able to see it for herself. Addie pulled the paper closer and read the foundation's name once more. Then she said she needed to go home and collect her belongings, that she needed to leave today, and she said it in the voice of someone who had just finished a task, not someone who had just fallen apart. They arrived at the house at 20 minutes past 10 on Monday morning, at a time when Preston was certain to be sitting in a conference room on the 4th floor of the district attorney's office building. The 2 cars parked half a block away, and no one got out. Rocco walked with her to the door, then stopped on the front step, the very step mentioned in the hospital report, and said he would wait there. Addie told him to come inside. She said, I've only got one hand, and the box is heavy. She unlocked the door and entered the house where she had lived for 10 months. And the first thing she realized was that she didn't know what she owned inside it. She walked through the living room and saw nothing that belonged to her. She passed through the kitchen and saw nothing there either. In the bedroom, her clothes occupied 1/3 of the dresser, and she remembered that when she first moved in, they had taken up half of it. But she couldn't remember when that had changed. She packed her clothes into a canvas bag. She took her medicine, her phone charger, and the photograph of her mother from the bottom drawer. The photograph she had quietly moved from the top of the dresser into the drawer 9 months earlier, after Preston remarked that the bedroom should look tidy. She carried everything downstairs in 3 trips. Then she went up to the attic one final time, and Rocco carried Sean's box down. She stood in the middle of the living room, looked around once, and said she was finished. Then she remained still. Rocco asked whether there was anything else. Addie didn't answer immediately. She turned and walked toward the table against the wall in the corner of the dining room, the table she had always used for grading papers. And there sat a stack of pages nearly 16 inches high, held between cardboard covers and tied with string, where it had remained for months. They were her students' writing assignments, paragraph exercises written by men and women in their 50s and 60s who were learning how to form a complete sentence. She pulled the stack out of its cardboard cover, placed it on the table, and turned to a point about 1/3 of the way down. Between 2 assignments was a thin school notebook, the kind with ruled pages sold 3 for $1 at the drugstore, its pale yellow cover worn at the corners. She pulled it free with her right hand. Rocco looked at the notebook, then at the stack of papers, then back at her. He asked how long she had kept it there. Addie said 11 months. He asked whether Preston had never found it. Addie said no, then added that he had never touched this stack of papers even once. She said, in 10 months, he never read a single piece written by one of my students. She said, I once gave him one to read, just once, during the 2nd month. It was written by a 57-year-old welder, about the day he read a street sign for the first time. She said, he took the page, looked at it for about 3 seconds, handed it back, and said it was pretty good. She said, I never showed him anything again. Then she said, that's why I kept it here. She opened the notebook. Inside were lines written in pencil, the handwriting small and even. The words crowded close together to conserve paper, and the handwriting wasn't hers. It slanted farther to the right, the letters were rounder, and the dates were written in an entirely different style. She said, I practiced writing this way for 2 weeks before I started recording anything. She said, if he ever found it, I would tell him it belonged to a student. She said, I wrote in pencil so I could erase it if I needed to. Every entry began with a date, then a time, then a place, followed by 1 or 2 sentences describing what had happened, with no adjectives, no emotion, and not a single word about how she had felt. Some entries were 3 lines long, some were only 7 words. Rocco turned through several pages, then stopped. He asked how many. Addie said 71. She said the first entry was dated April 19th of the previous year. She said the last was from the previous Friday night, and she had written it with her right hand in the hospital bed at 2 o'clock in the morning while Preston was outside smoking. Rocco closed the notebook and placed it on the table between them. He said nothing. Addie looked at it, lying there on the tabletop. A notebook sold 3 for $1, beside a stack of assignments written by people who were only beginning to learn how to write, and she picked it up with her right hand. She held it for a long time. Then she spoke, not to Rocco, not to anyone, but aloud into the room, and said, "This is what I kept." Then she slipped the notebook into the pocket of her coat, fastened the button, and said, "Let's go." She reached the door and paused for a moment, not to look back at the house, but to place the keys on top of the shoe cabinet beside the entrance. 3 keys threaded through a metal ring, and the sound they made when they touched the wood was the final sound she ever created in that house. On Monday evening, Addie still went to the center. Rocco said she should rest. She said the class began at 8 o'clock, and if I don't go, 23 people will stand outside the door in the snow, and then turn around and go home. He drove her there. The center occupied the ground floor of an old building on Fillmore Street, with a narrow hallway and a classroom door that opened directly onto it, and Rocco said he would wait in the car. Addie said, "Suit yourself." But outside, the temperature was about 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and after 19 minutes, he came inside and stood in the hallway with his back against the wall, about 2 steps from the open classroom door. He didn't look inside. He only listened. From the classroom came the scraping of chairs, the sound of people greeting one another, someone asking what had happened to the teacher's arm, and Addie's voice saying that I slipped on the ice. "So everyone be careful. The roads are dangerous this time of year." Then the lesson began. He heard her explain a paragraph writing exercise. He heard her read a sample sentence, and then ask who wanted to try. For about 30 seconds, no one answered. Then came the sound of a chair being pushed back. Addie said, "All right," and she called the name of a man, and the voice she used when she spoke that name was unlike any voice Rocco had ever heard from her before. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't encouraging. It was simply ordinary in a way that made whatever was about to happen seem like the most natural thing in the world. Rocco leaned a few inches to his left and looked through the opening. The man standing inside was about 58 years old, dressed in work clothes, holding a sheet of paper in both hands, and the paper was trembling. He began to read. He read slowly. He stumbled over the 4th word and stopped. No one in the room said anything. No one laughed. Addie didn't read the word for him. She said only one word, again, and he began the sentence from the beginning, and this time he made it past that word. He continued. He stumbled again in the middle of the 2nd sentence and stopped once more, longer this time, long enough for Rocco to see the man's shoulders begin to tighten, and Addie still said nothing. She simply stood there and waited, and there was something in the way she waited that made the man release a breath and continue. He finished the 2nd sentence, then the 3rd. Then he read the entire paragraph, 5 sentences, not a long one, about a morning when he was on his way to work and saw the name of the street he had traveled for 30 years. When he finished, he didn't look up immediately. He remained standing there, staring at the paper in his hands for several more seconds. Then he sat down, and Rocco saw him place the page on the desk and lay both hands over it to keep them still. The whole class applauded. It wasn't polite applause. Someone slapped a hand against a desk. Someone whistled. An elderly woman in the front row turned all the way around and clapped toward him, and the man lowered his head over the paper and didn't lift it throughout any of it. Then Addie said thank you and moved on to the next person, and the noise faded, and the lesson continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened, and it was precisely that, the fact that no one treated it as extraordinary, that made Rocco turn his face away and look down at the hallway floor. He stood there for nearly another hour. He didn't look into the classroom again. He listened. He listened as she corrected each person without once making it sound as though they had made a mistake. He heard her tell one woman, "You wrote this sentence beautifully, and I'd like to hear you read it again, more slowly this time." He heard her tell someone else, "It's all right, we'll try again next week." He listened to 23 adults speaking inside a room where not one of them appeared ashamed, and he knew exactly how much work it took to create a place like that, because for the past 15 years, his work had been to enter rooms and make people fall silent, and he had become so good at it that he no longer had to try. He thought about that while he stood leaning against the wall. The woman 2 steps away from him was doing the exact opposite of everything he had done his entire life, and she had been doing it 3 evenings a week for 17 months without receiving a single dollar. At 9:30, the class ended. People came out one by one, and each of them glanced at Rocco before looking away, because in that neighborhood, people had learned long ago that staring too long was a mistake. The 58-year-old man was the last to leave. He folded the paper into quarters and placed it carefully inside the breast pocket of his shirt, then gently patted the pocket once. Rocco watched him until he reached the door. Then he turned and went inside. Addie was stacking chairs with one hand. He walked over and put away the rest without saying anything, and as he set the final chair in place, he said that he had dropped out of school when he was 15 years old, and he said it in the voice of a man talking about the weather. Then he turned off the lights. On Tuesday morning, inside a rented room at a motel on Bailey Avenue, Addie opened Sean's box for the second time, and this time she took everything out. She worked slowly with one hand, arranging each item in a row across the bed: a coat, a broken wristwatch, 3 books, a ring holding 4 keys, including one very small brass key she didn't recognize, a photograph of the two of them standing outside a sandwich shop, Addie about 10 years old, Sean about 17, both of them laughing, and at the very bottom, pressed against the floor of the box beneath a layer of old newspaper, was a blue address book about the size of her hand, bound with a spiral spine, its pages yellowed along the edges. Addie opened it, and for the first 6 seconds, she thought it truly was an address book. It was divided alphabetically. It contained names, telephone numbers, and street addresses. Then she looked more closely and saw that every telephone number contained 11 digits instead of 10, that the names repeated themselves in ways that made no sense, with the same name appearing on 4 different pages beside 4 different addresses, and that some of those addresses had house numbers 5 digits long. She handed the book to Rocco. He took it, opened exactly 3 pages, then closed it again. He said nothing for a while. Then he said it wasn't an address book. Addie asked what it was. He said it was a ledger. He said the name column contained account codes, the telephone number column contained amounts and dates, and the address column contained location codes. He said the entire book was a recording system disguised as something anyone who glanced through it for a minute would close and dismiss. Addie asked whether he could read it. Rocco was silent for about 2 seconds, then said no. He said, "I know what it is because I know what it was used for." He said, "I can't read what's inside it." Addie was about to ask another question when he said that Sean had kept every set of books connected to Rocco's operations for 3 years, and that Rocco had never checked a single line himself. And after saying it, he rose and walked to the window, and Addie understood that the conversation was over, though she didn't understand why. Around noon, Owen Brandt called. He said he hadn't found the names of the 2 women who had withdrawn their complaints, but he had found something else he didn't know how to handle. He said that while tracing the public records of cases Preston Hale had worked on, he had obtained an index of evidence from the active investigation, targeting the Vasari business group, the kind of document a court was required to release in abbreviated form. He said most of the contents had been blacked out, but the item numbers hadn't. And within that index, one confidential witness code appeared repeatedly. The code CW4. Rocco took the telephone and told him to send the index immediately. 40 minutes later, Frank Delahunt called back from Rochester. He said he had finished reading it. He said the rules governing redacted documents were very strict, that officials were allowed to conceal the substance but weren't allowed to conceal the structure, and that structure always told a story when the person reading it knew where to look. He said the code CW4 appeared a total of 29 times in the index. He said the entries were arranged in the chronological order in which they had been received, and that he had compared the unredacted date marks at the bottom of the pages. Then he stopped. He asked Rocco when the investigation had begun. Rocco said 2 years ago. Frank Delahunt said then there was a problem. He said the first entry connected to CW4 didn't fall within those 2 years. He said it appeared in a different investigative file that had later been incorporated into this one, a file that was much older, and that the earliest document carrying that code bore an intake date from the spring of 2016. He said that made 9 years as of today. He said 9 years didn't describe someone who had been arrested and offered information in exchange for leniency, because a person like that spoke once and then disappeared from the record. He said 9 continuous years meant a stable source, someone who had been maintained, protected, and cultivated, and it meant that person had never stopped talking. Then he said one final thing, that the person had to be on the inside, and had to be high enough to keep knowing things worth entering into an investigative file for 9 years without ever running out. No one in the room spoke. Addie looked at Rocco. He was still standing beside the window with the telephone in his hand, and he didn't move. She saw him repeat the number once, very softly, almost without sound. 9 years. Then he asked Frank Delahunt a question, and he asked it in a voice so even that Addie had to look closely before she noticed his other hand pressing against the window frame hard enough to turn his knuckles white. He asked whether the spring of 2016 came before or after September of 2017. Frank Delahunt said Rocco already knew perfectly well that it came before, meaning the staged crash that took Sean's life was ordered long after the betrayal had already begun. Rocco said, "I need you to say it," Delahunt said, 1.5 years before. Rocco remained motionless for a long time after the call ended, long enough for Addie to think he had forgotten she was still sitting there. And when he finally turned around, his face was completely normal, and she realized that was what made it frightening. On Wednesday afternoon, Owen Brandt called again and said he had found one of the two names. He said the woman was Meredith Vance, 38 years old, a former prosecutor in that same office who had resigned 4 years earlier and now worked for an insurance company in Amherst. He said he had contacted her through an intermediary attorney, and she had refused to meet Owen Brandt, refused to meet Kit Donnelly, and refused to meet anyone carrying either a law degree or an investigator's identification card. Then he said she had set exactly one condition. She would meet Adeline Kerrigan, alone, inside her car, for no more than 30 minutes. Rocco said no. Addie said, "I'm going." She said it before he had even finished his second word, then added that he could park as far away as he liked, but he wasn't allowed to get out of the car. At 4 o'clock the following afternoon, in the parking lot of a shopping center in Amherst, Addie opened the door of a silver car and sat down in the passenger seat. Meredith Vance was gripping the steering wheel even though the engine was off. She hadn't turned off the heater. She didn't look over. She said, "I have 30 minutes, and I'm not signing anything today." Addie said, "I didn't bring any papers." Meredith Vance looked down at her cast, then turned her eyes back toward the windshield. She said, "I heard you slipped on the ice." Addie didn't answer. Meredith Vance said, "I worked in that office for 7 years, and I heard that sentence about 400 times. Then she was quiet for a long while. Then she said she wanted to make one thing clear from the beginning, that he had never hit her. She said, not once. She said there was no photograph anyone could take, no medical record, nothing at all. She said, he only made me understand that I could be replaced. After saying it, she stopped, then began to explain. And she explained in the voice of someone who had rehearsed these words in her mind hundreds of times, without ever speaking them aloud to another person. She said, he never criticized me. He praised other people. He praised a female colleague 4 years younger than I was, while I stood there listening, and he praised her sincerely. Praised her for exactly the things I didn't have. He did it for 10 months. By the 11th month, I had begun changing the way I spoke, the way I dressed, the way I presented arguments in court. By the 14th month, I filed a complaint. 9 days later, I withdrew it. Addie asked why. Meredith Vance said, because I realized I had nothing to offer as evidence. She said, I had 7 years of prosecutorial experience, and I couldn't write 3 sentences proving what had happened to me. She said, I sat in front of that complaint form for 3 hours, and in the end I withdrew it because I had started believing that I was the one with the problem. Then she turned to her right and looked directly at Addie for the first time, and she said she hadn't agreed to meet her that day because of any of that. She said, I agreed to meet you because of your last name. Addie sat perfectly still. Meredith Vance said, 3 years ago, when I still worked there and still had access to the record system, he asked me to do something for him. She said, he asked me to retrieve the file from a closed case, a traffic accident. The victim had died, she said. He told me it was connected to another active case and that he needed to compare names. She said, I retrieved the file and gave it to him, and I didn't ask any more questions. Then she said the name on the cover of that file was Kerrigan. There was no sound inside the car except the steady rush of the heater fan. Addie heard her own voice ask what date it had been. Meredith Vance said November, 3 years earlier. Addie went still, and inside her mind a calculation began running on its own, one she couldn't stop. 3 years earlier meant November of 2022. She had met Preston Hale at the library fundraiser in December of 2023. 13 months later. She lifted her right hand to cover her mouth. No sound came from her for about 5 seconds. Then her shoulders began to tremble, and tears ran down across the back of her hand, and she left them there, without wiping them away, without saying anything, until the wave passed. Meredith Vance didn't touch her, and didn't offer a single word of comfort. She only passed her the box of tissues. When Addie was able to speak again, her voice was raw. She said, "I thought I was the one who started the conversation," she said. "I told my friends that story," she said. "I was proud of it." Then she said, "I can survive having my arm broken." And she lifted the cast slightly as though pointing to it. And she said, "I don't know how to live with knowing I was only a tool." Meredith Vance looked at her for a long time. Then she said she didn't have an answer for that. She said, "But I'll sign." She said, "Tell your attorney to prepare the papers." On Friday morning, Rocco drove back to Brooklyn alone and told no one where he was going. He parked in front of the 2-story house in Bensonhurst, where he had grown up, and the person who opened the door was his mother, Julia Vasari, 70 years old, a woman who hadn't left that street in 44 years. She looked at his face, then stepped back to let him in, and she didn't ask why he had come home at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning. She only said, "Go into the kitchen. The light is better there." He placed the blue notebook on the table. He said it belonged to Sean Kerrigan. Julia stopped in the middle of pouring coffee. She set the pot down. Then she sat, wiped her hands on her apron, and drew the notebook toward her. Before she married, Julia had managed the entire record-keeping system for his grandfather for 11 years. And no one in that house had ever spoken of it aloud, because it was the kind of thing people allowed silence to bear witness to. She put on her glasses. She opened the first page. Rocco pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and he said nothing more. She read very slowly. She didn't turn the pages quickly, didn't skim, didn't ask a single question. Every few minutes, she took a small piece of paper and wrote several words, then crossed them out, then wrote them again. The coffee went cold in 2 untouched cups. Outside the window, a man was shoveling snow from the sidewalk, and the scrape of metal against concrete carried into the kitchen in a steady rhythm. After about 40 minutes, she stopped at a page near the end and remained motionless over it for a long time. Then she turned back about 10 pages, compared something, and returned to the first page. She did that 3 times. Rocco saw her shoulders change. She didn't release a breath. She didn't raise a hand to her chest. She simply sat a little straighter. And to someone who had lived beside her for 37 years, that was the clearest sign in the world. She removed her glasses. She asked, "Do you know how gifted that boy was?" Rocco said, "I know." She said, "No, you don't." She said he hadn't merely recorded money coming in and money going out. She said that every time he saw a payment that was wrong, he added another line in the column on the right, and that line wasn't an amount. She said that line identified the person who had given him the order. Then she said he had been doing it for 3 years without telling anyone. Rocco asked how many lines there were. Julia said 17. She said 16 of those lines referred to 16 different people, and the names meant nothing because they were only errand men. She said there was one other line. She said the final line, dated September 12th, 2017, carried the same command code as 15 of the earlier lines. She said that code stood above every other code in the notebook. Rocco said nothing. Julia watched her son for a moment, then said the last thing she had to say, that the boy had known before he died, and he hadn't told Rocco because he knew Rocco wouldn't believe him. Then she picked up the pencil, pulled the scrap of paper toward her, and wrote a name. She wrote slowly in capital letters, the way a name is carved into stone. Then she pushed the paper across the table toward him and withdrew her hand. Rocco looked down. 2 words were written on the paper. Aldo Ferrante. There was no sound in the kitchen. The shoveling outside had stopped at some point, though neither of them had noticed when. Rocco didn't move. He didn't reach for the paper. He didn't stand. He remained seated in that chair, staring at those 2 words, and the only thing that changed in him was his breathing. It slowed, then slowed further, until the movement of his chest was almost impossible to see. Aldo Ferrante was 58 years old. Aldo Ferrante was the man who had taught him how to drive. Aldo Ferrante was the man who had sat at this kitchen table for Sunday dinner throughout Rocco's childhood. Aldo Ferrante was the man who had stood to Rocco's left at his father's funeral and placed a hand on his shoulder as the coffin was lowered. And the man who had told him that evening, "From now on, you don't have to ask anyone else, you ask me." Aldo Ferrante was the man who had sat 2 seats away from him at every meeting for the past 6 years. And Aldo Ferrante was the man who, on that final night, had told him to go alone, that it was a long drive and he would travel faster by himself. Rocco remembered that detail, and still he didn't move. Julia asked one more question, very softly. She asked what he intended to do. He didn't answer. He stood, picked up the notebook and the scrap of paper, folded the paper in half and then into quarters, and placed both inside the inner pocket of his coat, beside the old telephone. Then he bent down and kissed his mother's hair. She caught his wrist and held it for a moment. He gently loosened her hand. He walked to the door, and when he reached the sidewalk, he stood in the cold for about 30 seconds. His eyes lowered toward the snow that had been shoveled into neat banks on either side, and there was only one sentence in his mind, that 9 years meant it had begun before. And before meant Sean Kerrigan hadn't died because of a car. Rocco sat in the car outside his mother's house for nearly an hour without starting the engine. Mr. Calderone found him there. He opened the passenger door, climbed in, closed it behind him, and sat in silence for about 2 minutes before asking. Rocco handed him the piece of paper. "Mr." Calderone unfolded it, read it, then folded it again along the same creases, and placed it on the dashboard. He didn't ask whether Rocco was certain. He only said that he had known that man since he was 24 years old. Then he said that if this had happened 3 years earlier, it would have been over before nightfall. Rocco said, "I know." Mr. Calderone said, "Then do it." Rocco said nothing. Mr. Calderone turned to look at him and said he didn't need a speech. He only needed to know why Rocco was still sitting there. And Rocco said, "Because I made a promise." Mr. Calderone remained silent for a long time. Then he said the sentence Rocco would later remember more clearly than anything else spoken that day, that he was keeping his word to a woman he had known for 9 days, instead of to a man who had stood beside him for 30 years. Rocco stared straight through the windshield. He said, "That's right." Mr. Calderone waited for another sentence, but none came. Then he exhaled and said, "All right, then we do it another way." And he asked who Rocco wanted in the room. The meeting took place on Saturday night, inside a closed restaurant in Ozone Park. 4 men sat at the main table, and the man in the middle was Ugo Ansaldi, 74 years old, a man no one in their world addressed as anything but Mr. He had occupied that position for 19 years. He didn't like meetings at night, and he had made that clear before taking his seat. Rocco placed the blue notebook on the table and said he wasn't asking permission to do anything. He was only presenting the facts. Then, he presented them. He spoke for 40 minutes, and never raised his voice once. He spoke about the 17 additional entries in the notebook. He spoke about the command code that appeared 16 times. He spoke about the court's evidence index, the confidential witness code, the number 9 years, and the fact that those 9 years had begun before the autumn of 2017. He didn't say a single word about Sean Kerrigan as someone he had known. He referred to him only as the bookkeeper, Mr. Ansaldi listened to everything without interrupting, and when Rocco stopped, he asked exactly 3 questions. He asked who had read the notebook. Rocco said, "My mother." He asked who else. Rocco said, "No one yet." He asked the 3rd question, "What do you want?" And Rocco said he wanted Mr. Ansaldi to forbid anyone from touching Aldo Ferrante. The entire table fell silent. One of the men sitting to Mr. Ansaldi's left said there was no precedent for such a thing. Rocco said that if Ferrante died that week, then within 48 hours, 3 federal agencies would come asking questions of every man seated at that table, and Ferrante would die as a witness who had been silenced, and his death would be worth more to them than everything he had revealed over 9 years. He said that if Ferrante lived, and if he no longer knew anything, then he would be nothing more than a 58-year-old man with nothing left to sell. Mr. Ansaldi studied him for a long time. Then he said, "All right." The ruling was delivered in 4 minutes. Aldo Ferrante was stripped of every share, every position, and every right to be present. He was forbidden from entering any of the 5 boroughs. No one was permitted to contact him. No one was permitted to tell him anything, and no one was permitted to sit at the same table with him for the rest of his life. Mr. Ansaldi made it clear that if anything happened to him, the person responsible would be one of the men sitting in that room. Then he said, "Bring him in." Aldo Ferrante entered and sat in the chair prepared for him, and he understood everything within about 3 seconds. The way men who had lived a long time in that world always understood. He didn't deny it. He didn't beg. He listened while Mr. Ansaldi read the ruling, then turned his head to the right and looked at Rocco, and he said, "Your father would have shot me already." He didn't say it as a challenge, but as an observation, almost as a lament. Rocco looked back at him. He let the silence stretch for about 4 seconds. Then he said, "My father is dead." Then he said, "I'm not." Aldo Ferrante remained seated for another moment, then stood and walked out, and no one in the room rose to see him off, and the restaurant door closed behind him at 20 minutes past 11 that night, and it was the last time anyone at that table ever saw him. That same evening, nearly 400 miles to the northwest, Addie's telephone vibrated inside the motel room on Bailey Avenue. It was Kit Donnelly. She said Meredith Vance's affidavit had been signed and notarized at 5 o'clock that afternoon. Then she added one more sentence, and she said it in an entirely different voice, faster and sharper. She said, "I made a call." Then she said, "Don't ask." Then she ended the call. At 8:45 on Monday morning, along the stretch of Delaware Street in front of Preston Hale's campaign office building, 6 black cars were parked beside the curb. Every one of them sat properly within a marked space. Every parking meter had been paid. 12 men stood beside the vehicles in the snow, 2 men to each car, and they did absolutely nothing. No one smoked. No one spoke to anyone else. No one blocked the sidewalk. They simply stood there with their hands resting in front of their stomachs, their faces turned toward the street, as silent as men waiting for a funeral to begin. Pedestrians passing that stretch of road saw them, and every one of them did the same thing, slowing for half a step before continuing without looking back. A police patrol car passed at 5 minutes to 9, slowed down, observed them, then continued on, because there was nothing there to stop for. Rocco stood at the corner, about 50 feet from the main entrance. He didn't come any closer. Addie arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, walking from where she had parked 1 block away, her left arm still in the sling and her right arm holding a hard-covered document case against her body. She walked past the 12 men, and not one of them looked at her, and she understood that their refusal to look at her was also part of what had been arranged there. Mr. Calderon stood beside the glass door. When she reached it, he pulled it open and held it for her, and he did so exactly as any 54-year-old man might hold a door for someone whose hands were occupied, without bowing his head, without speaking, without the slightest trace of ceremony. Addie said, "Thank you." He said, "You're welcome." She went inside. Rocco remained at the corner. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor and passed the reception desk of the campaign office, where a young woman looked up and said, "Miss Kerrigan, does he know you're coming?" Addie said no, then walked directly to the door at the end of the hallway and opened it without knocking. Preston Hale was sitting behind his desk, with 2 other people in the room. He looked at her, then at the document case, and for about 1.5 seconds, he said nothing. Then he told the other 2 people to leave. They left. The door closed. Addie didn't sit down. She walked to the front of the desk, placed the document case upon it, opened it, and began taking things out one by one, setting each item on the desktop several seconds apart without saying a word. The first was a copy of her Mercy General medical record bearing Dr. Helen Vogt's signature, with 3 sections marked in colored ink, 3 repetitions of the phrase stating that the injuries were inconsistent with the reported mechanism. The second was a complete photocopy of the yellow notebook, all 71 entries numbered and stamped with the date they had been received by the law office. The third was a comparison of the flow of money between the Lakeshore Futures Foundation and the campaign, accompanied by the minutes from the board meeting the previous September, with his name listed as chairman, and the line documenting the elimination of funding for the evening program. The fourth was a notarized affidavit, 3 pages long, signed by Meredith Vance. Preston stared at the 4th document longer than he had looked at the first 3 combined. Then Addie placed the final paper on the desk. It was a request form for the retrieval of archived records, the standard printed form used by the Erie County District Attorney's Office, dated November 14th, 2022. The requested file bore the name Kerrigan, and in the box identifying the person making the request was Preston's own signature. She placed it in the center, on top of everything else. Then she stated 4 things. She didn't read from a page. She said that first, he would withdraw from the election before 5 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, citing personal reasons and offering no further explanation. Second, he would resign as chairman of the Lakeshore Futures Foundation and restore in full the funding that had been cut from the Learning Center, subject to an independent audit. Third, he would never contact her again in any form, either directly or through another person, beginning the moment she walked out of that room. Fourth, he would sign a notarized statement describing what had happened during the previous 10 months, and that statement would be sealed and held by her attorney. She said that if he fulfilled all 4 conditions, she wouldn't file a criminal complaint at that time. She said that if he refused, everything lying on the desk would be sent simultaneously to 4 different places on Thursday morning. Preston remained silent for a long time. Then he began, and over the course of about 90 seconds, he made 4 moves. For the first, he leaned forward and said that she wasn't well, that she had just suffered a serious injury, that he was worried about her, and that he believed she needed to see a doctor before making any decisions. Addie didn't answer. For the second, he leaned back, changed his tone, and said that most of what lay on the desk could be explained, that the minutes of a board meeting didn't prove motive, and that the affidavit of a resentful former employee was worth no more than the paper it had been printed on. Addie still didn't answer. For the third, he said very calmly that she should think carefully about the people beside whom she had chosen to stand, that she should ask herself whether she truly knew who the man outside on the street was, and that if any of this became public, the name appearing in the newspapers wouldn't be his. Addie said, "That was your third move." Preston stopped. Then he made the fourth. He lowered his voice until it was scarcely more than a breath, and he said, "I was going to marry you." Addie looked at him. She said, "You were going to marry my brother's name." Preston Hale didn't answer that. He straightened in his chair, opened the drawer on his right, took out a thin case file, and placed it on the desk beside her papers. He didn't open it. He said that now it was his turn. He said that for the past 2 years, he hadn't merely been building a case involving construction contracts and garbage trucks. He said he had the file from the night of September 12th, 2017. He said he had the crime scene report, photographs, a forensic conclusion, stating that the victim's injuries weren't entirely consistent with a vehicle collision, statements from 2 witnesses who had later withdrawn them, and a chain of documents showing that the man standing outside on the street had been in that same city on that very night. He said the only thing he had lacked for 8 years was a blood relative of the victim willing to stand up and say that their brother had been murdered. He said that without such a person, the file was nothing but paper. Then he named his price. He said she could gather up her papers and walk out of there, file no complaint, send nothing anywhere, and he would close the file on the night of September 12th forever. Or she could continue, and he would bury the man who had driven 380 miles through a snowstorm for her. He told her to choose. Addie stood motionless for about 4 seconds. Then she said that at 7:40 that morning, Kit Donnelly had submitted every one of these documents, the originals, to an agent named Diane Halloran with the Public Corruption Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Buffalo office. She said there was a receipt. She said Kit had also submitted one more thing he hadn't seen. Then she took the final sheet from the case and placed it on top of his file. It was a copy of the 17 additional entries from the Blue Notebook, accompanied by a handwritten decoding and a notarized statement from the person who had deciphered it. She said her brother had recorded the name of the person who ordered every improper payment over the course of 3 years. She said 16 entries referred to 16 errand men. She said the 17th entry, dated September 12th, 2017, carried the same code as 15 of the earlier entries, and that code wasn't Rocco Vasari. She said it was Aldo Ferrante. Preston didn't move. Addie continued, and her voice didn't rise or quicken. She said that 3 years earlier, he had retrieved her brother's file from the archives. She said the request form lying on the desk carried his signature. She said that around that same time, his source identified as CW4 had already been providing information for 7 years, and no one maintained a source for 7 years without knowing who that person was. She said that meant he had held the name of the man who ordered her brother's murder in his hands, that he had read it, and that he had put it away. She asked why. Then she answered the question herself. She said because an active case targeting a family whose name was known throughout the state was worth far more than a closed case involving a 26-year-old accountant whose face no one remembered. She said one would put him in the district attorney's chair, the other wouldn't. She said, "It wasn't that you couldn't solve my brother's case." She said, "You chose not to." The heating system hummed steadily in the room, and there was no other sound. Preston Hale placed one hand on the desk, but he didn't reach for anything. His hand simply rested there, spread open, and Addie watched his fingers curl slightly, straighten, then curl again. He couldn't form a single sentence. The expression that had protected him for 14 months, the expression that made people smile back at him before they even had time to glance at her, didn't leave him all at once. But piece by piece, and what remained beneath it, looked much smaller than she had ever imagined. Addie gathered her papers, arranged them neatly with one hand, placed them inside the case, and closed it. She said she would never come back there again. Then she walked out and closed the door. She didn't take the elevator. She took the stairs, and on the first step, she began to count. 1, 2, 3. She counted all 14 steps in the first flight, then paused on the landing for about 3 seconds before continuing. 14 more steps. She counted them slowly, one at a time, keeping her breathing in rhythm with the numbers, exactly as she had counted the ceiling tiles in the hospital that Friday night, exactly as she had counted everything that could be counted since she was a child. 42 steps. She pushed open the door and stepped onto the sidewalk, and the cold air struck her face. The 12 men were still standing exactly where they had been. Not one of them asked a question. Rocco was standing at the corner, and when he saw her, he took one step forward. Addie raised her right hand. He stopped immediately. His entire body stopped, and he didn't take another step. She stood there breathing. One breath, then another, her hand still raised. Then she lowered it, and she walked toward him. Preston Hale was indicted at the federal level on 3 groups of charges: obstruction of justice, wire fraud, and witness tampering, along with a state assault charge referred from the very medical record Dr. Helen Vogt had written on that Friday night in February. His election campaign ceased operations within 9 days, and the final campaign sign was removed from a lamppost on Delaware Street one Thursday morning. The New York State Attorney Disciplinary Board began proceedings to revoke his license to practice law 4 months later. Rocco paid the price exactly as he had known he would. The blue notebook that passed into federal hands carried more than Aldo Ferrante's name. It carried 3 years of detailed records tracing the flow of money through part of the empire Rocco himself had led, and he had held it in his hands for 3 days before surrendering it, understanding every consequence before he opened his hand and let it go. The assets of 2 companies were frozen. 4 people were indicted. The council met again in April and removed him from the position he had held for 6 years. He didn't argue a single word. He surrendered his entire share in exchange for the right to walk away and remain alive. And Ugo Ansaldi agreed because Rocco's father had done something for him 40 years earlier, a debt he had never repaid. When Addie asked whether he regretted it, he said he had been what he had been, that for the rest of his life he would become something else, and that she had no obligation to stay and watch. He sold the house in Bensonhurst that summer. He wanted to give the money to the center, and she refused until he agreed to her conditions, that every dollar would pass through a foundation subjected to a public audit every year, that Kit Donnelly would serve on the oversight board, and that his name would appear on no sign, no brochure, and no page the public could read. He said, "All right." She said, "I'll check." He said, "I know." 1 year later, the East Buffalo Community Learning Center was renamed the Kerrigan Center and moved into a 2-story building with an elevator on Fillmore Street. Adeline Kerrigan, 28 years old, served as program director. Ruth Ann Pell was still there, still seated behind the same old desk, still the person who opened the doors at 7 o'clock every morning. Meredith Vance taught a basic legal literacy class on Thursday evenings, teaching people how to read a rental agreement, how to understand a summons, and how to write a petition in a way that wouldn't allow it to be ignored. There was a new program for women who had recently left controlling relationships, and the people teaching those classes were women who had lived through the same thing themselves. Rocco ran a legitimate construction company on the south side of the city with 19 employees, 7 of whom had been released from prison within the previous 2 years. On a Tuesday evening in October, inside a classroom on the first floor, it was one student's turn to read his work. The 38-year-old man stood, held the paper in both hands, and began. He stumbled over the 6th word. He stopped. No one said anything. The teacher standing at the back of the room spoke only one word. Again. And he began the sentence from the beginning. He read all 5 sentences. When he finished, he looked at the paper in his hands for another moment before sitting down, and the entire class applauded, and he placed both hands over the page to keep them still. On the reception desk of the center sat a landline telephone connected to an old number. It was the number for which one man had paid the bill for 96 months, without ever hearing it ring even once. Now it was the center's direct helpline. It rang every day, sometimes 8 times, sometimes 20, and someone always answered on the other end. This story leaves us with several things worth considering. Some promises are kept in silence for years, unseen by anyone, praised by no one, and then one night they save an entire human life. The cruelest thing people can do to one another isn't to wound the body, but to make someone believe their worth exists only in the benefit they provide to others. True justice is rarely loud. It doesn't need an explosion. It simply closes one door after another until there is nowhere left to escape. And the kindest thing we can offer another human being is the belief that they deserve to be heard. Whether that person is a teacher giving literacy lessons at night, a 58-year-old worker reading a complete paragraph for the first time, or anyone lifting a telephone without knowing whether someone on the other end will answer. If today's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that together we can hear more meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And did you recognize anything in it that connects with the real lives unfolding around you? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video. We wish everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and until we meet again.